We have our final speaker, definitely last but not least. We have Jason Reza Jorjani, who is an Iranian-American philosopher and lifelong native New Yorker. He did his BA and MA at New York University and completed his doctorate in philosophy at the State University of New York. And Jason is an author of 8 books. His first book, Prometheus and Atlas, won the 2016 Book Award for the Parapsychological Association. He's also the author of World State of Emergency, Levers of Sophia, and many more. And he's also the founder and leader of Prometheism, or the Prometheus movement. And I believe in Jason's today's lecture, which is titled Modernity as an Event Horizon for a Promethean Future, we'll definitely hear more about his concept of Prometheism and the figures of Prometheus and Atlas. So I'll give that over to you now, Jason.
Thank you, Simon. Sorry again for the time confusion. I've been sitting here looking forward to talking to you all. And as you suggested, I mean, you could have solicited a talk on any subject from me, but since you did ask me to talk about a Promethean vision of the future, that's what you're going to wind up getting. So for better or for worse. So here we go. It's going to be about an hour-long lecture, I would say, and then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A, if that's okay with you. Sounds good?
Perfect.
Yeah? Okay. Modernity as the event horizon of a Promethean future. The future is both the most promising and the most dangerous idea in human history. For most of recorded history, the idea of the future remained inconceivable to people in all of the great civilizations of Earth. These ancient civilizations, whether in the Americas, Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, or in South and East Asia, all had cyclical conceptions of time and mythical worldviews oriented towards an ideal past. Despite certain specific differentiations, the cosmologies of the Mayans, the Greeks, and the Romans, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Hindus, and the Chinese all conceived of time as a decline through a series of world ages that were each increasingly degenerate departures from a bygone golden age, lost in the primordial past. They all believed that this epochal decline would end in some worldwide catastrophe, which would usher in a new golden age through the return of the heavenly deities to Earth. The cycle would then restart, being destined to inevitably end in decline and destruction over and over again for all of eternity. Traditionalists who want to retrieve this pre-modern worldview see chaos as a mere degradation of order. To them, order, which is called rata in Sanskrit and cosmos in Greek, is an eternal structure of being. This is conceived of as a macrocosm, which may be mirrored or distorted to a greater or lesser degree of fidelity by the microcosm of the individual person and the collectivity of a society. The order itself never changes. Even its variant instantiations on the microcosmic level follow fixed patterns of increasingly degraded fidelity until the gods, the Hindu devas or Greek Olympians, restore order at the end of every cycle. By contrast, the essence of modern thought about the relationship between order and chaos is that emergent and determinate order draws from out of a background of indeterminate chaos as a wellspring of innovative creativity, thereby yielding progress in all domains, albeit not necessarily in anything resembling a straight line, and potentially admitting of many dialectical regresses and triangulations within an overall forward-oriented developmental trajectory. All legitimately modern thought is teleological in this way. The teleology of the future, French l'avenir, German die Zukunft, Persian Ayande, the teleology of the future as what is to come and what is coming into being is an idea that is encompassed by my concept of the spectral revolution. This is a concept that I first developed in Prometheus and Atlas, which was written in 2012 and published in 2016. In understanding what I meant by the spectral revolution and how it is integral to the Prometheus vision of the future, let us start with the word specter. The word Prometheus is employed here as a contraction of Prometheus and theist, in other words, someone who has embraced Prometheism. The word specter has a number of different meanings. One of the reasons why I chose it to develop the concept of the spectral revolution is because of its polyvalence or multiplicity of meaning. I wanted to capitalize on all of the different meanings that it has. First of all, specter or spectral evokes the spectrum. In other words, a phenomenon wherein there are no sharp divisions or clear distinctions. The spectral is consequently the undoing or undermining of various binary oppositions. For example, the binary oppositions of light versus darkness, being versus nothingness, truth versus deceit, good versus evil, spirit versus matter, male versus female, and left versus right. One thing that I mean to suggest by spectral revolution is the revolution that undoes or deconstructs all of these binary oppositions. This revolution would reveal that we are projecting these binary structures onto the spectrum of phenomena for various utilitarian purposes, and that these sharp distinctions are not intrinsic to existence. A specter is also what is yet to come. This is how Karl Marx uses the term specter in the opening of his Communist Manifesto, when he writes with Engels that, quote, "there is a specter haunting Europe, the specter of communism." In this sense, the word specter is already very closely related to revolution because Marx was advocating a global communist revolution. In any case, the spectral is also what is yet to come. What I mean to suggest by that is that Heraclitus was right that we live in a cosmos that is a process. We do not live in an already completed whole, as Parmenides or as the Vedic sages believed, with their concept of Brahman, or one unified being that is eternally complete, in light of which our experience of time is Maya, or illusion. Rather, time is real, and nature is a process. The futural, or future-oriented character of existence itself makes the world spectral. Once one starts to think of existence as becoming rather than as static being, one realizes that all of these binary oppositions are also only relative, and they are constantly deconstructed and reconstructed by the process of existence. The third meaning of specter is the idea of a ghost, which is the most commonly understood meaning of the word. Here, I'm trying to suggest that the essence of technological science is something ghostly. Although we tend to think of science, and especially technology, as the most materially tangible thing in the world, and despite the fact that our current scientific establishment is working with a materialist paradigm, the whole of techno-scientific development is actually a ghostly phenomenon. It is almost like demonic possession, wherein the archetype of Prometheus is working his will through us onto the world. The question is whether we want that to be a passive relationship or whether we can transform it into an active rapport that is more constructive. I owe the idea of the essence or spirit of technology to Martin Heidegger. I have further developed it from out of his thought. Heidegger is a philosopher whose work is radically historical and self-reflective on the history of philosophy and the history of science. Heidegger was advancing the thesis that our various interpretations of being, from epoch to epoch, have concealed as much about existence as they have revealed. So, we need to be able to understand our process of the interpretation of existence in order to be able to deconstruct these various frameworks that have covered over nature and that have trapped us in a certain perception of the world. In particular, Heidegger argued that from the epoch of Plato onward, there is a trajectory of abstract thinking and a representational relationship to nature, which ultimately yields modern materialistic science, with Descartes being the turning point in that trajectory, which begins with Plato and ends with Nietzsche's conception of the will to power as its culmination. In that construction, Descartes is something like the fulcrum, and Nietzsche is the inversion of Plato. In analyzing that whole trajectory of development, Heidegger identifies the phenomenon of technological science as it is unfolding throughout history as expressing a kind of spirit or essence. However, Heidegger was never clear on what or who this spirit is. He made certain innuendos about a potential return of the gods, which would supposedly save us from the total instrumentalization and dehumanization of our existence. He even suggested that, somehow, the particular god or deity who would return would have to transform technology from within its own essence. In other words, Heidegger recognized that we cannot simply escape or retreat back into traditionalist paganism, let alone medieval tradition, and act like the modern technological epoch never happened. Modern technology, Heidegger insisted, has to be transformed in its own essence. There are these hints that I pick up on in Heidegger when I suggest that the God who has to return in order to transform our relationship with technological science is Prometheus. After all, Heidegger evokes Prometheus as the deity of technological science in his rectoral address, the speech that he delivered when he became the rector of Freiburg University. What has to happen is that the mindless Frankenstein's monster relationship to technology that we have hitherto had for centuries now needs to be transformed so that it is a relationship to Prometheus in the positive sense of the deity who gave us techne of craft. Not just technology, but also craft in the sense of poetic creation. Techne was a form of poesis for the Greeks. It was one modality of creative production. So Prometheus is also the god, or rather the titan, who brings us not just the fire of the forge, but all of the arts and crafts. We need to cultivate a more artful relationship to technology that is going to prevent us from being dehumanized. In Prometheus and Atlas, fresh out of doctoral studies and still under the spell of contemporary continental philosophy, I made the mistake of putting the title, The Postmodern Prometheus, on the chapter wherein Frankenstein features prominently as part of an attempted revival of the archetypal power of Prometheus. I've since come around to realizing that there's nothing postmodern about what I wrote there. In fact, there's nothing to postmodernism at all, other than a cynical psychological warfare and social engineering project that aims to deconstruct the modern just so that tradition can prevail again. Of course, the vast majority of its proponents have not realized that they are dupes being used for this, being used by people who take Julius Evola's Ride the Tiger to heart, or who think along similar accelerationist lines about hastening the supposedly inevitable collapse of the modern world. This cynical traditionalist accelerationism ought to be sharply distinguished from futurism, despite the fact that the two became strange bedfellows in the context of Italian fascism and the early working relationship between F.T. Marinetti and Benito Mussolini. Futurism is, in a sense, the defining spirit of modernity as such. A robotic workforce, personal flying cars, cities under the sea, colonies in space, and many other innovations that were expected by the year 2000 were only the surface layer of a deep futurism that spanned from Italy to America and then extended to Japan in the decades after Hiroshima. Even the Russian cosmists of the 1920s were part of this global project to soar headlong into the ever-expanding horizon of the modern age. The Soviet Union embraced its own vision of this Promethean ambition in a bid to rival capitalism with a promise of a more just and universal utopia. Psychotronics, or Soviet parapsychology, was part of this modernist vanguardism. Contrary to what many theorists of the modern assume, modern and modernist movements were not all reductively materialist. This is especially clear when one examines the work of a number of leading modern artists and literary figures, from Vasily Kandinsky to André Breton and Franz Kafka. Their work is steeped in the occult, even if it represents a radical revolt against tradition. In the realm of science, psychical research and its successors, parapsychology and psychotronics, were uncompromisingly scientific in their methodology and entirely consistent with what actually characterizes the modern mindset. Judging by the empirical rigor of research in the field and the complexity of data analysis, parapsychology or psychotronics has a more legitimate claim to being a modern science than psychology or sociology do. The reason why many theorists have missed this when formulating a phenomenology of the modern or of modernism is that they have mistakenly drawn an equivalence between modernity and anti-tradition. The latter is a term introduced by the traditionalist French writer René Guénon in order to designate the atheistic and materialistic form of modern thought that rose to prominence during the French Revolution and was eventually embraced by the scientific establishment of the Western world. In his book, The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times, Guénon contrasts this anti-tradition with a different modality of modernity, one which he has noticed heralds of as he's writing in the 1920s through the 1940s, but which he believes is yet to come to its culmination. Guénon calls this the counter-tradition. Unlike the reductively materialist and atheistically secular anti-tradition that was epitomized by the French cult of reason and the Marquis de Sade, the counter-tradition is profoundly spiritual. Guénon, writing as a staunch defender of perennial tradition, sees the counter-tradition as the ideology of the coming Antichrist. It is the full flowering of modernity. Prometheus and Atlas made the mistake of conflating modernity in general with the anti-tradition, and of confusing the counter-tradition that Prometheism represents with something postmodern, rather than the fully modern. I affirm Guénon's claim that there really are only two types of worlds, a world of tradition and a modern world. A period like the Italian Renaissance, or for that matter Hellenistic Alexandria, is an example of a world in transition between tradition and modernity. In the Alexandrian case, the transition was aborted by the institutionalization of Christianity, and in the case of the Renaissance, it was retarded by the Vatican. In writings such as Revolt Against the Modern World, and especially Ride the Tiger, Julius Evola was a cynical supporter of certain currents of modernism, having even been a Dadaist painter in his youth, because he thought that the collapse of the modern world ought to be accelerated. From his traditionalist perspective, which is most closely aligned with Hindu notions of yugas, or world ages, and the caste hierarchy of a world that ought to be ruled by the devas, the gods, modernity is simply the Kali Yuga, the last and darkest age of deviant degeneracy in a perennially repeating cycle of world ages. Bringing this age to an end sooner by intensifying its destructive forces would therefore accelerate the advent of the new Golden Age, or the next Satya Yuga. The term New Age is a source of a great deal of confusion because to some people it signifies this dawning of a new Golden Age, which is an entirely traditionalist idea, whereas to others it means what it did to German intellectuals who used die Neue Zeit, literally the New Age, as a term for the modern age in the German language. Modernity is the age defined by the very idea of the new. Guénon, after all, saw the New Age movement, which had already begun in his epoch, as the rising counter-tradition, wherein the spiritual takes the form of the psychical that can be grasped scientifically. Guénon thought that a scientific approach to the occult was quintessentially modern, and that the Antichrist would come to power by means of the technological production of miracles. The distinction between modernism and postmodernism in architecture, the arts, including cinema and literature, can be examined with a view to demonstrating that there is nothing positively or substantively new about putatively postmodern work that was not already there in modern work. For example, so-called postmodern architecture is just neo-deco when it is not trash, and Dada, which was sometimes literally trash, is at least as deconstructively engaged in satirical and absurdist parody as anything postmodern. Is Frank Lloyd Wright a postmodern architect simply because he fuses modernist geometric rationalism with ancient decorative motifs from various cultures? Of course not. Wright is absolutely modern. Anyone who thinks that the line between modern and postmodern art and literature is drawn by some rejection of the rational, or by a supposed commitment to linear progress, is clearly ignorant of the place of the irrational and the archaic in surrealist art and poetry, which is radically modern. Modernity is the event horizon of the technological singularity. This is the notion that various convergent advancements of technology are going to fundamentally alter the parameters of human existence. These include biotechnology, or gene editing, robotics and nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and psychotronics. The first 3 sections of this presentation will be devoted to examining these various facets of the technological singularity. The vortex around which rapid transformations of modernity revolve as an event horizon is appropriately named a singularity because if one graphs human technological development, at a certain point the slope on that graph curves sharply upwards and it becomes a spike. While at any point on that graph, one could extrapolate from past data points to future data points and come up with some idea of what further technological progress might consist of and how it would transform society. After all, this is the whole history of futurism and of science fictional visions of the future. When one gets to that spike on the graph, one cannot project from the past to the future. One has reached a moment where the world has been so fundamentally transformed by technological development, and this transformation is happening so fast that on account of this exponential acceleration, it is impossible to project forward. Of course, what this also means is that one is reaching the limit of the conceptions that the human mind is capable of forming and the limits of the human imagination. After examining the various mutually reinforcing technological developments converging into the singularity in the first 3 parts of this presentation, the 4th and final section will focus on how the archetype of Prometheus can guide us in successfully navigating the challenges of restructuring society worldwide in order to survive and thrive in the face of the singularity. My contention will be that only a society structured around the archetype of Prometheus can secure us a future wherein singularity-level technologies are constructively integrated into a positively post-human or superhuman community, the actualization of which would represent the culmination of the ever-accelerating transformative process that is modernity. How are you all doing? You good? Okay. 1. Biotechnology. Biotechnology offers us a variety of potentials to promote human flourishing. Using embryo selection, which is an augmented process of in vitro fertilization, where you're able to profile the embryos that are then reinserted in the womb for development, it's possible to eliminate hereditary diseases. It's also known that there's about a 15-point range in IQ between the brightest child one could have and the one that will have the hardest time studying various disciplines. IQ can be increased by around 15 points per generation using embryo selection alone without modifying the genetic structure of the embryo. Of course, intelligence is an imprecisely defined term, but there are certain factors of intelligence that have to do with the ability to learn physics and manipulate complex mathematics, which have strong genetic correlates. It is very important that we establish some kind of consensus regarding how this technology is going to be used. If we were to have a 15-point IQ increase per generation in only one country or one culture, this would introduce a dangerous imbalance of geopolitical power. On account of the history that eugenics has in the Western world, views about using this technology for what are essentially neo-eugenic purposes are largely negative in the West. By comparison, the Chinese scientific, academic, and political establishment is almost 100% in favor of using emerging biotechnologies to, for example, enhance the IQ of its population. The specific factors of intelligence that can be manipulated by this process are the very ones that lead to engineering breakthroughs, which historically, unfortunately, have had their first manifestations in military technology. Even within a single country, if only the wealthy have access to this kind of technology, we could see class disparities turn into real caste distinctions between a genetic aristocracy and others who are not so genetically fortunate. The social implications are even more significant when we think about genetic engineering, which actually does modify the genetic structure of an embryo. We can lengthen lifespan. It's been found that mice who have been genetically engineered for a longer lifespan also have compressed morbidity meaning that at the very end of their lives they decline very quickly rather than going through a prolonged aging process. We would also be able to enhance physique. The same techniques that were initially developed to treat Lou Gehrig's disease have been applied to the end of boosting muscle mass and decreasing the chances of obesity. Then, in terms of cognitive functioning, there are also genetic engineering techniques that were developed initially to treat Alzheimer's that have been used to boost memory capacity by 2 or 3 times. These particular enhancements sound very positive, but genetic engineering also gives us the capability of splicing human and animal genes. We really ought to ask ourselves whether we want to create a hybrid species. That is not a decision that should be left to one country or culture, let alone a corporation operating in the global free market. One of the most controversial biotechnologies is human cloning. Even if we were to have a fairly widespread consensus that human cloning for the reproduction of identical persons, in other words, the creation of a large number of twins, is not a great idea, human cloning is implicitly part of embryo selection. It's often the case that when an optimal embryo is inserted into the womb for development, the initial implantation is unsuccessful and another attempt has to be made. Consequently, if one already has arrived at an optimal embryo, cloning that embryo a number of times allows for repeated attempts at implantation. Since cloning is going to be part of augmenting embryo selection, a more acceptable form of biotechnology, there's no telling how else cloning might be used unless we have an effective regulatory system on a global scale. The worst thing that may happen with biotechnology, which also brings us into the domain of robotics or cybernetics, is that some country or civilization might unilaterally decide to genetically engineer a race of slaves. The creators of these biomechanical robots might find a way to convince us that their creatures are not really human beings who would be the bearers of any political rights. Gene splicing that incorporates the elements of the genome of other animals might make it possible for these humanoids to work under adverse environmental conditions that would be difficult for humans to tolerate. This is the promise and the peril of CRISPR technology, which has recently rendered genetic engineering much more practicable and precise. CRISPR has come to broadly refer to a method of appropriating and redirecting the natural mechanism for the repair of DNA, which breaks all the time in response to various environmental stimuli, such as a person being subjected to a standard X-ray. Making the cut in the right place has been compared to placing a cursor between the letters of the Gattaca sequence in the proverbial word processor of the genome before rewriting it. CRISPR is now being used on humans to cure sickle cell anemia, muscular dystrophy, and even cancer. Consider the dual uses of this technology. The same gene editing used to cure muscular dystrophy on a therapeutic basis could be used to enhance muscle mass across the population, not just amongst those who opt in for this enhancement, but potentially in future generations born to parents who choose to have their child's embryo edited. Fyodor Uranov, who worked at Sangamo Biosciences from 2000 to 2016, points out that there is one gene, SCN9A, that makes a protein that is responsible for pain transmission signals. Editing this gene out using CRISPR could help manage terrible pain in cancer patients, but it could also be used to produce special forces soldiers invulnerable to torture. Whereas before CRISPR, gene therapy on humans was achieving 2% correction, the genome of 80% of the cells in a subject can now be corrected or re-engineered. If desired, this can include the cells of germline genetic material, such as sperm and eggs, which would pass any genetically engineered change down onto the offspring of the human subject of the CRISPR editing. Not surprisingly, in 2015, China became the first country in which scientists legally and openly began gene editing human embryos using CRISPR. CCR5 was the gene targeted in the first human embryos edited in China. It is the receptor for HIV, and removing it from the genome of the edited embryos immunized the genetically engineered children against the AIDS virus. It was not long before Chinese corporations, such as Darwin Life and Ova Science, were promising their clients designer babies with all kinds of genetic modifications, including enhanced IQ, within a decade. In other words, well before 2030. As President Vladimir Putin recognized in his remarks at the World Festival of Youth at Sochi, Russia, on October 21st, 2017, this technology could be used not just to cure heritable diseases, but to genetically engineer mathematical and musical geniuses, or super soldiers, who feel neither fear nor pain. Putin suggested that the implications of CRISPR-driven gene editing are more terrifying than the invention of the atomic bomb. He is right. 2. Robotics and nanotechnology. To an extent, biotechnology is converging with research in robotics. One of the most recent advancements in robotics research is biomimetic design. This is the idea that we should look to insects and other non-human animals for inspiration in robotics. In particular, robotic spiders and robotic flies that have been developed, which would be ideal for surveillance. They can crawl under your door or fly in through your window. They look like real insects, and yet they're equipped with miniaturized components that allow them to provide surveillance to their remote operator. We will soon be living in a world where one cannot tell whether the insects that one is trying to swat in one's home are actually surveillance drones. More frighteningly, these robotic insects could be designed to mimic mosquitoes with stingers, except that the stinger is a microsyringe that injects poison into a targeted person. Another development that is related to this is work on transformers, robots that can shapeshift, at institutions such as Carnegie Mellon. There will soon be biomimetic robots that can change from being a spider into being a fly by reorganizing their structure. So while thinking that one has successfully shooed a fly away, the same robot re-enters one's home in the form of a spider that continues to offer both audio and video surveillance, or, in the worst case, carry out the most untraceable assassination. Terrorism will reach another level when drone robotic flies fitted with microcharges can suddenly converge on a targeted person in a park and detonate their explosives near his jugular. Progress in the field of nanotechnology means that these robotic systems can be scaled down to a microscopic level. Nanoscale robots could be especially valuable in the medical field as intelligent surgeons that operate within the body on a molecular level, making it appear as if cancers in sensitive areas full of nerves, which a scalpel runs the risk of severing, are simply dissolving. Unclogging arteries would also be a lot easier. But the implications of these nanobots for industry are truly astounding. Imagine the 3D printing technology of today being replaced by printers that assemble computer-generated or 3D scanned and modeled objects on a molecular level, akin to the food replicators or holodeck of Star Trek. When combined with weak AI expert systems and human-scale robots, as well as airborne drone robotic delivery systems, such robotic assembly on a nanoscale would bring the need for every kind of drudgery to an end. What this also means is that sometime within the next 2 decades, 90% or more of the human labor force will be unemployed. To use Henry Kissinger's terminology, they will suddenly become useless eaters, quote unquote. Anyone outside an elite engaged in creative work and driven by higher goals will be considered a purposeless consumer of robotically produced goods. This revolutionary disruption of the global economic system would be one of the many indications that we have arrived at the event horizon of the singularity and are about to be inescapably captured by its vortex. As the mass unemployment crisis sets in and all contemporary economic models fail to offer financial analysts any guidance, we will begin to feel the gravity of the situation. As with all aspects of the singularity, the effects will not be gradual, or intensify in a linear manner that can be projected. The robotics revolution and industrial production augmented by nanotechnology will explode at an exponential growth rate until only expert systems are considered remotely competent in even attempting an analysis of the situation and suggesting solutions that would address the implosion of our world financial system. It is also the case that once nanotechnological design becomes feasible, it would be much easier to overcome the locomotion problem in robotics and build robots that are capable of autonomously replicating any human physical movements. Robots with much sharper perception and more subtle dexterity would in turn be able to engage in nanotechnology design and manufacture far more effectively than human engineers. Nanotechnology will also lead to the further integration of robotics with cybernetics and virtual reality. We are now witnessing a proliferation of drones, especially in the context of warfare. One of the technologies that the Pentagon is developing under DARPA is the ability to project a pilot's mind into a drone through virtual reality so that the pilot really feels like he's flying in whatever environment the drone is patrolling. Through a haptic suit, the pilot gets tactile feedback from the airframe of the drone. This begins to give the drone operator a different sense of embodiment than a human being ordinarily has. There are brain interfaces being developed that will allow the pilot to control the movements of the drone without any explicit commands. In other words, by thought alone. The aim here is to improve reaction time in aerial dogfights. But if one combines this system with fully immersive virtual reality, including tactile feedback from the airframe of the drone, are we really even dealing with a human being anymore? Will these drone pilots begin to dream of themselves as some other type of creature? The first form of post-human artificial intelligence may be parasitic on the organic elements of human intelligence. 3. AI and psychotronics. The current model for achieving artificial general intelligence is fundamentally flawed, and it will fail. But the failure of mechanistic approaches to engineering artificial general intelligence is going to lead to what I call the spectral revolution. Parapsychologists have been studying what they call psi abilities in high-level laboratories, such as the Pear Laboratory at Princeton University, for a century now. But it has taken place on the margins of the scientific establishment. What is going to happen is that well-funded AI research programs at institutions such as MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon will meet with repeated failures the closer they get to strong artificial intelligence. The scientists working on these projects will notice psychic phenomena in the laboratory and in their computer systems. They will start to deal with weird instances of anomalous information exchange and disruptions in the information processing that are basically what psychokinesis researchers have been dealing with for decades. Consequently, ESP and PK are going to become engineering problems for AI researchers. That is when the spectral revolution will be fully unleashed. When, in the course of a hard-minded, materialistic attempt to create AI, engineers are just going to come up against these bottlenecks that force them to recognize phenomena that parapsychologists have been studying for a century. Then, once that is processed, a different kind of approach is going to be taken toward AI, which involves a lot of biotechnology and robotics or cybernetics. At that point, there will be a breakthrough. That's my prediction. The technological singularity, as I see it, is inextricable from the spectral revolution. These two are going to converge to radically transform our society in ways that most people are not ready for. The more comprehensive genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and robotics become in their approach to analyzing, replicating, and augmenting the function of human organs, including the brain, the more these nuts and bolts research programs would come up against enigmatic psi abilities. ESP and PK would be acknowledged as research and development problems in the development of artificial intelligence or in the integration of the brain with cybernetic systems, perhaps for the purpose of downloading human consciousness into an android body. There would be problems of morphogenesis relevant to genetic engineering that could not be solved but by factoring in non-local morphic resonance that, quite apart from DNA, impacts embryological development by endowing a baby with characteristics of the body that belonged to the psyche that is about to be reincarnated as that child. Ostrander and Schroeder's psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain demonstrated that, despite the unequivocal atheism and supposed materialism of the putatively scientific framework of the Marxist Eastern Bloc, the psychotronics program of the Soviet Union and its satellite states had far surpassed America in government-funded psychic research on latent human abilities such as extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. This makes the case that spectral phenomena are a subject of empirical research in scientific laboratories. To treat such paranormal manifestations as miracles that reaffirm faith in revelation was just a tactic of psychological and social control that self-proclaimed prophets and manipulative clergymen would use on people, falsely conditioned to believe that natural abilities, which we share with animals, are supernatural demonstrations of divine power that lie outside the scope of scientific study. In the 1970s, work was done by psychotronics researchers in Prague to develop devices that would be able to channel and amplify psi abilities. As nanotechnology, of the kind that Drexler was already envisioning, becomes a reality, such devices could be much more precisely designed. It is also likely that genetic engineers would be able to identify correlates for biological predisposition to becoming a psi virtuoso. They could then edit the genes of an embryo in such a way as to endow children with this trait at birth, potentially on a population-wide basis. Once we reach the event horizon of the singularity in terms of technological development, hitherto marginalized and suppressed psi abilities would also have to be recognized by mainstream science. At that point, total social collapse on the scale of a planet-wide Salem witch panic will be inevitable, unless we forge a society wherein no one would think to misuse ESP and PK to harm their fellow citizens by committing avaricious or vengeful crimes. Such crimes would be untraceable by normal law enforcement procedures and impossible to prosecute retroactively by means of the established procedures of our impartial justice system. Fourth and final section, the Promethean revolutionary struggle. If we are resolved to secure the forward march or headlong plunge of humanity into the singularity, what is it that we are really willing here, even in the best possible case? Especially considering the convergence of material technologies and psychical techniques with the potential to transform society in the most radical ways imaginable. Singularity-level technologies and techniques will mean the end of personal security and individual privacy. The only way for society to survive this transformation is to have a population that consists solely of individuals who always only wish the best for one another. What defines the best, Greek agathon, the good, or kalon, the beautiful, that any person may wish for any other in a given society, is the ethos common to that society. If the Prometheist wills to unchain the full techno-scientific potential of the singularity, then given the unprecedented dangers involved, it stands to reason that she will also have to muster the will to forge a Prometheist society worldwide. To the extent that there remain any hostile social or political outliers, there will be worldwide war. And such a global conflict with singularity-level technologies could bring not only human life, but all terrestrial life to an end, without affording anyone the opportunity for a positive transition into a superhuman state of being. We have no more than several decades left to decide whether it is better to let ourselves be regressed to a feudal or archaic pre-industrial society, or whether we are intent on following through with the technological singularity and the spectral revolution that I argue would come with it. As already suggested above in relation to psychotronics, once we reach the event horizon of the singularity in terms of technological development, hitherto marginalized and suppressed psi abilities would also have to be recognized by mainstream science. At that point, total social collapse on the scale of the witch panics of old would be an eventuality. The only thing to do is to ensure that transgressions using psi ability never take place to begin with. Since in the realm of psychic ability, which functions mostly unconsciously, to intend something, maybe to make it happen, there is no solution other than to make sure that such spectral crimes are unthinkable to whoever remains in society. That would reduce the population base to the same very small minority who could also be trusted never to weaponize nanotechnology or misuse increasingly ubiquitous gene editing abilities in ways that would threaten the public welfare far more seriously than terrorists, thugs, and malcontents were able to do with the tools at their disposal in the 20th century. Evolution is an exclusionary process that selects against the majority of a population group who fail to exhibit a mutation that adapts them to environmental stresses. The selection for a mutation is, as a general rule, a selection for deviation from the norm and the evolution of a few who become the progenitors of a new species at the expense of the many. This selection will take place on the basis of who is capable of embodying the archetype of Prometheus, and thus of constructively taking conscious control over the spectral force of technoscientific development in the maelstrom of the event horizon of the technological singularity. Prometheus is the first freedom fighter. The archetype of Prometheus tacitly reflects a recognition that freedom is the most fundamental fact in the cosmos. The cosmos is inconceivable without consciousness, which presupposes intentionality. Some degree of free will, however conditioned, is a prerequisite of anyone being personally accountable for meaningful actions. A cosmos in which our creative acts do not add anything that was not predetermined and that could not have been foreseen or anticipated, even by the providence of a deity, is a world that is not worth living in. Prometheus is, of course, also the deity who most fully epitomizes foresight. His very name means to think ahead, and when Zeus chains him to a rock in the Caucasus, the eagle pecking out his liver is a symbolic expression of Zeus seeking to devour and appropriate the superior power of precognition, projection, and anticipation that is characteristic of Prometheus. However, the purpose of this definitively Promethean power is to expand our scope of free will and self-determination, not to constrain it with a sense of inexorable fate. Foreseeing possible futures, whether by the intuitive means of precognitive clairvoyance or through rational projective analysis, or a balance of both, actually affords us the opportunity to become the masters of our own destiny. Various factors do condition thought, constrain the will, and limit the imagination, but the capacity to exercise individual freedom at some level despite these factors is a sine qua non of any meaningful conception of existence. Only a discontinuous and somewhat internally dissonant cosmic structure, which always preserves a degree of chaos, allows for this kind of creative individuality. Understanding such a structure precludes and is mutually exclusive of a putatively scientific commitment to mechanistic reductionism, religious faith in an omniscient and omnipotent God, and the belief that there should or ever can be an end to violent struggle and strife. Any entity falsely claiming omniscience and omnipotence so as to demoralize people by subjecting them to the illusion of the futility of resistance is simply Zeus by another name. Prometheus redefines the preconceived limits of the possible, making the putatively impossible possible by means of technological science. The Prometheist has the strength to grasp the burdensome fact that the truth is what works. Knowledge is not the mirroring of an objective reality by a subjective cognition that only needs to be rendered more perceptive and precise, like a mirror that requires polishing. Knowledge is radically pragmatic because technology is ontologically prior to science, which is inseparable from the technology that makes theoretical research possible and renders knowledge discoverable. Rather than distinguishing science from technology and misconstruing technology as applied science, we should always conceive of them as the unified phenomenon of technoscience, wherein theoria is inconceivable apart from praxis. Scientific knowledge is the white light of molten metal in the forge of industrious innovation. Science ought not to be confined within any particular paradigm, which also constrains technological innovation. Instead, various paradigms and the theories that they make possible ought to be seen as different scientific models that each offer us the potential to craft certain types of technological tools for handling things better, and ultimately for expanding the horizon of our achievable aims. Multiple and mutually inconsistent paradigms can be exploited simultaneously for the sake of their power to foster discovery and act as a framework for invention. As the deity whose mind races ahead to survey the most distant horizons of possible futures, Prometheus also offers us inspiration as a sacred fountainhead of creativity. The inspirational power of beauty is an expression